Okay, good afternoon, everyone. A huge welcome to you all and a massive thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. We have a tremendous event ahead of us and just completely delighted to be hosting this important discussion featuring Hanan Ashrawi, Gideon Levy, Virginia Tilley, and John Dugard. What a lineup. So my name is Bianca Mageni and I'm with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which is one of the organizations that is co-presenting this event. And we're co-organizing this with Independent Jewish Voices, whose vision is for a just peace in Israel-Palestine based on the principles of equality and human rights. David Kattenburg, our moderator, who's with both the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and with Independent Jewish Voices, will tell you a little bit more about IJV's work and mission shortly. So our goal for today is to have simultaneous translation. We're having some technical issues with that. We're hoping to be able to have translation from English to French. We'll be posting about that in the chat. Like I said, there's a few issues, but we'll let you know when that starts working. Nous avons une traduction simultanée l'anglais vers français. Les informations sont dans le chat. Il y a quelques difficultés techniques, mais nous vous informerons quand cela commencera à fonctionner. So, as I mentioned, this event is going to be opened up by our moderator, David Kattenburg, who's going to be in conversation with our panelists, and then we're going to move on to our Q&A. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can, time permitting. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that many of us are gathered here today on Indigenous land. And today I'm speaking to you from Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. And it's a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among many First Nations. Also, it's amazing to see this turnout. There are more than 900 people that registered for this event, which is phenomenal. So thanks to all of you for tuning in. Also, we're live streaming to Facebook as well. So it would be great if you have any friends that haven't been able to join us via Zoom, but who still want to join. You can let them know that they can watch on Facebook, facebook.com/IJV Canada. So again, my name is Bianca Mageni, and I'm here representing the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. And we're an organization that challenges unjust foreign policy measures and aims to bridge the gap between the perception and the reality of Canadian foreign policy abroad and Canada's role in the world. And you can find out more about the work that we do at foreignpolicy.ca. So I just want to make absolutely certain that this webinar is live right now. Okay, good. Yeah, I can see the participants in here. Just wanted to confirm. So again, you can find out more about our organization at foreignpolicy.ca. We're an organization that's entirely dependent upon donors. So if you want to donate, it's foreignpolicy.ca/donate. And so we launched less than a year ago with a campaign that was actually to oppose Canada's bid for a seat on the UN Security Council on the UN Security Council. And one of the major focuses was Canada's anti-Palestinian policies. Canadian policies matter. And our government has sided with Israel repeatedly in almost every matter of importance. The Canadian government has a trade agreement with Israel that treats occupied West Bank settlement as part of Israel. Last year, our government sent a letter to the International Criminal Court demanding it not investigate Israel's war crimes. The Canadian government has voted against more than 50 UN resolutions upholding Palestinian rights that are supported by almost every nation on earth. In Canada today, young people are recruited to join the Israeli military in contravention of Canada's Foreign Enlistment Act. And hundreds of millions of dollars in donations are subsidized by taxpayers for Israeli charities, some of which support groups that are backing the Israeli military, West Bank settlements, and also some explicitly racist organizations. So unfortunately, if that wasn't bad enough, none of this perhaps even comes close to one of the worst Canadian contributions to Palestinian dispossession. In 1947, Canadian officials Lester Pearson and Ivan C. Rand played very important roles in crafting and promoting the partition plan that gave the Zionist movement 55% of historic Palestine, despite the Jewish population making up less than a third of the population and owning 7% of the land. So a major way that we living in Canada can contribute to the Palestinian struggle is to understand our own role and history and to challenge our own government here at home. And it is now my distinct pleasure to hand over the mic to David Kattenburg, who's going to be moderating this discussion. Welcome panelists. I'm handing it over to you, David. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Bianca. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Kattenburg. I come to you from Winnipeg, which happens to sit on the territories of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Dakota, the Dene, the OG Cree nations, and it is also the homeland of the Métis people, the great Métis people. I am involved in various ways around this issue. I'm a member of Independent Jewish Voices. IJV is a grassroots organization grounded in Jewish tradition that opposes all forms of racism and advocates for justice and peace for all in Israel-Palestine. The larger Zionist organizations here in Canada refer to Independent Jewish Voices as a fringe group. We are actually Canada's largest and most influential progressive Jewish organization. I'm just maximizing my screen here, juggling various balls at the same time. So what we're going to do is launch into a discussion that's going to take about 45 minutes or so, in which I'm going to ask each of our panelists some questions revolving around three themes. It's going to be a dynamic affair, I hope. And at the hour, about 45 minutes from now, we'll open up the floor to questions. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our four very eminent panelists. John Dugard comes to us from the Netherlands. John Dugard is a distinguished international jurist who was born in South Africa and founded the Center for Applied Legal Studies at Wits University, Witwatersrand in South Africa, was one of the leading legal figures and legal scholars who helped bring an end to South African apartheid. John has lived in the Netherlands and Leiden for quite a number of years, and he is I could say lots of things about John Dugard. He's the author of a book called Confronting Apartheid, A Personal History of South Africa, Namibia, and Palestine, which you should all pick up. It's John Dugard, and of course, John was some years ago, the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. I believe he was the predecessor to Richard Falk. That's John Dugard. Virginia Tilley is a distinguished scholar based at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, and first went to South Africa in 1985, I believe, for a brief period, went back and spent some years there studying the system of apartheid in South Africa. She is was the author together with Richard Falk of a document called Israeli Practices Towards the Palestinian People and the Question of Apartheid, which was published back in 2017 by the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, ESQA. It was posted up at the ESQA site and then subsequently taken down in response to intense fury from the Zionists. We'll post a link to that document. So that's Virginia Tilley. I could tell you so much more. Gideon Levy esteemed and venerable correspondent and journalist for Haaretz, Israel's preeminent progressive publication, newspaper, the author of numerous commentaries and firsthand reports from the occupied Palestinian territories. I should say here in Canada, listening to CBC radio, nothing, Canada's public broadcaster, nothing gets me more excited or fills me with so much happiness than to hear that either Gideon Levy or Hanan Ashrawi are going to be on the radio, on Canadian radio, because we don't get to hear progressive voices like these as often as we should here in Canada. So that's Gideon Levy and also Hanan Ashrawi, who I'm sure you all know is one of Palestine's most preeminent political figures going back many, many years. Born in Nablus, Palestine, in a wonderful city. I've had the pleasure to visit Nablus. And Hanan lives, I think, at the present moment in Ramallah. She was, I mean, so much can be said about Hanan Ashrawi. She was one of the architects of the involved in the early stage of the Oslo negotiations. Back at Madrid, Hanan can correct me. Hanan was involved in the Madrid negotiations years ago, back in the late 1980s. And since then she's done a lot of things. She's been, of course, involved centrally in the Palestine Liberation Organization. And up until recently, Hanan was on the executive committee of the PLO. And at some point, Hanan, you quickly tell us if you are indeed still on the executive committee. You're not. She's saying no. I think Hanan withdrew.
No, I have resigned, finally. I've been trying to do so for a few years.
You can tell us more about this. So anyway, Hanan she's an academic, a scholar, an activist, and a political figure of enormous stature. So those are my introductions. I'm going to launch into the first of our themes here, and this is going to be fun. I'm going to share a screen. I teach microbiology twice a week, as it happens, and so I have certain experience on Zoom and putting up PowerPoints and such. So show video panel. Get rid of that. No, get rid of hide video panel. Thank you. Okay. The UN Committee on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is one of these canonical documents springing from the United Nations Charter, right? The UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the four Geneva Conventions of 1949, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, key documents. Israel, the state of Israel, acceded to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and every 4 years, Israel submits reports to the committee, the UN committee that supervises the covenant, and issues concluding observations on Israel's reports. So this is the committee's concluding observations on Israel's report from 2014. There's a more recent report from Israel, but I've been unable to find the concluding observations to Israel's 2019 report. This quote is the same as back in 2014. The committee is concerned that the state party's domestic legal framework maintains a three-tiered system of laws affording different civil status, rights, and legal protections for Jewish Israeli citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem. By the way, these photos are my own images. So that's what the committee looking after the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights had to say about Israel's system. By the way, Israel denies that it is obliged to uphold the covenant in the occupied territories. That's another story. Then we've got the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, which similarly kind of looks after enforcing or, ensuring compliance with the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So Israel acceded to CERD and files regular reports. This is CERD's concluding observations on Israel's submission to CERD in January of 2020. The committee remains concerned by policies and practices that amount to segregation, such as the existence in the occupied Palestinian territory of two entirely separate legal systems and sets of institutions for Jewish communities in illegal settlements on the one hand, and Palestinian populations living in Palestinian towns and villages on the other hand. The committee is appalled at the hermetic character of the separation of the two groups who live on the same territory but do not enjoy either equal use of roads and infrastructure or equal access to basic services, lands, and water resources. Such separation is materialized by the implementation of a complex combination of movement restrictions consisting of the wall, the settlements, roadblocks, military checkpoints, the obligation to use separate roads, and a permit regime that impacts the Palestinian population negatively. John Dugard, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you here. I'm going to stop sharing. John, this is apartheid, isn't it? The descriptions of CERD and the Committee on the Covenant encapsulate the definition of apartheid, do they not? And what is the definition of apartheid under international law?
Well, David, I think it's important to stress that the conventions to which you have referred do condemn the policy of segregation, and the Committee on the Convention on Race Discrimination also condemns apartheid. But what is much more important is that apartheid has been designated as a crime by two important international conventions. First of all, there's the 1973 Apartheid Convention on the suppression and punishment of the crime of apartheid. But most important, there is the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which makes crime against humanity one of the important crimes falling within the jurisdiction of the court. And apartheid, the crime of apartheid, is designated as a species of crime against humanity. And this convention, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, defines the crime of apartheid as the commission of inhuman acts by one racial group against another racial group for the purpose of dominating it and oppressing that other racial group. So there are three requirements. First of all, there must be two racial groups. In the case of Palestine, there are two racial groups within the occupied Palestinian territory. There is the Jewish settler group backed by the IDF, numbering some 700,000 Israelis. And then there is the Palestinian group in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So you have two distinct racial groups. Inhuman acts have been committed by Israel. The Rome Statute provides that murder, torture, forcible transfer of persons, arbitrary imprisonment, and what have you, are examples of inhumane acts that constitute the crime of apartheid. And of course, this must be done for the purpose of systematically oppressing one racial group. So it's important that the international community has moved beyond merely describing racial segregation and apartheid as international wrong. They have now designated it as an international crime, and the International Criminal Court is examining this.
what I've just described to you seems a lot more elaborate and sophisticated than what South Africa had. Would you agree?
You're asking me?
No, John Dugard.
No.
John Dugard.
I wouldn't say the South African apartheid was different in the sense that the main concern about the main purpose of apartheid in South Africa was not only to segregate the different races, but to engage in territorial separation, to create separate states for different racial groups. But the important distinction between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid is that South African apartheid was completely open and transparent. It was regulated by law. It was on the statute book. Everyone knew exactly what was prohibited and what was not. The Israeli system is much more sinister in the sense that the law is not so clear. It consists mainly in military orders and military decrees in Hebrew, which are inaccessible to many Palestinians. And the whole system is much more obscure and sinister than the apartheid system. Let me just give you an interesting example. Shulamit Aloni, who was Minister of Education in the previous Israeli government, came across a Palestinian who'd been driving on a road reserved for settlers only. And an Israeli soldier had stopped the car and was about to confiscate it and arrest the driver. And she said to him, how is this man supposed to know that this road is reserved for settlers only? Oh, he said, Palestinians are expected to know the law. What do you expect us to do? To put up notices saying this is a road for settlers only? In this case, people would think we were just like South Africa and we had apartheid. And that sums it up accurately. The whole intention of the Israeli apartheid is really to obscure the discrimination that takes place, but it is very, very real and in many respects much more severe than it ever was in South African apartheid.
Virginia Tilley, talk about how Israel's apartheid regime works spatially as an integrated system. You've got an analysis revolving around this idea of 4 interlocking domains and one system. Can you tell us about this? You're going to have to unmute yourself.
You'd think after teaching for a semester, I would not have made that mistake. Sorry.
I've talked about microbiology for like 5 minutes straight until the student said, Dr. Kattenburg, unmute yourself.
Yes. Well, I've got the students all recruited to help me with these things. But coming to your question, what counts most here is how these domains, by the way, what I was saying when I was muted was that this was the UN report that came out in 2017, which you've linked on your website. And I think it's really explains all of this, I hope, clearly. But what counts about this geographic and political fragmentation is how these 4 domains, we're calling them, have allowed Israel to manipulate geography and international law to change how the conflict itself is understood. And some of this reflects on some things which John Dugard just said. So I'm hoping we can have a bit of a dialogue on that. Instead of understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as it's called, it understands the problem as an occupation. Okay, that the problem is military occupation. People living under military occupation whose rights are being denied them, instead of understanding the conflict as a century-long ethnic civil war for control of the state of Mandate Palestine. Mandate Palestine was established by the League of Nations in 1922, and it was supposed to become an independent state for all of its people, with no sectarian discrimination, or they didn't really use the word ethnic in those days, but they meant it, ethnic discrimination. discrimination. And instead, what's happened since 48 is that Israel has come to be accepted as a state, although its borders were never established. And its occupation of the remainder of Mandate Palestine is therefore seen as a military occupation and falling under international law regarding military occupations. That shift from a civil war, a domestic civil war within the state of Palestine, to an international conflict defined by occupation and calling for a withdrawal, I think it has to be reversed. I think it was a big mistake. I'm working on this theoretically, it's too much to get into now, but
excuse me, could I ask people to mute themselves because I'm hearing lots of interference. I can barely hear Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you,
These
Hanan.
can you quickly explain what are these 4 domains?
Yes, I'm getting to that. In a nutshell, Israel has managed to fragment the entire question of the Palestinian people into 4 legal categories, all carefully separated from each other in order to protect Jewish statehood. That's the overriding goal of all of this. Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, that's one domain. They are now the only people who are considered to have a seat at the negotiating table. Palestinian refugees is another domain, are completely excluded from the talks. They're the largest Palestinian population. They're completely separated. They've been converted from part of the problem to a final status question, like water or Jerusalem. Palestinian citizens of Israel are in a separate category now. They've been extracted from the Palestinian people and converted into a domestic issue for Israeli governance. So they're out of the picture. The whole system, therefore, works to keep Palestinians in the occupied territories, more than 5 million people, from linking up with these other populations in ways that could really challenge Israel's ethnic doctrines and be a real challenge to Jewish statehood. That's what the 4 domains are for. The final one is the peculiar situation of Palestinian residents of Jerusalem, who are there under the courtesy of Israeli residency laws, which have a little bit of fine tuning to account for the fact that they're in fact the indigenous people and not just foreign residents. But nonetheless, they fall into a different category where they're separated from the Palestinians in the occupied territories. And through this fragmentation, the whole system has operated to normalize the idea that the problem is only in the OPT, only in the occupied territories. This changes the entire conflict. It's broken up the problem of ethnic statehood, which took over Palestine and resulted in the logic of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians and the refusal to allow refugees back. All of that is part of Jewish statehood. And by taking the focus off of Jewish statehood and onto occupation, Israel has actually pulled off a very cool diplomatic and legal coup here. So where this is going, where the domain system is going now, is toward normalizing the idea of a state, Palestinian state, right, in the something like a state, as Israeli leaders have put it, in the occupied territories, in the West Bank and Gaza. The goal of this, of course, is to give this stateless population a state. But effectively, that's denationalization from rights within the state that actually controls their territory, which is Israel. It's a policy identical in many ways to the denationalization of Black people in South Africa. Regime sought to effect by transferring South African Black people's citizenship to the Bantustans, these enclaves where they were supposed to have little weak autonomy zones. Big leaf of independence allowed the apartheid regime to retain ultimate control. That's the path all of this is going down. I hope it's made a little clearer than I can do it in short here in the report. But the point is that we have to dismantle this artificial fragmentation of the Palestinian problem and rethink it completely. And the domains help explain how Israel is using the system through its own version of apartheid, its own unique configuration of racial domination in this land. And I'm
going to jump in there. I think you've given us a good summary. It's incredibly complex. Gideon Levy, as a journalist over the past many years, you've traveled up and down Palestine, observing and reporting on Israeli apartheid up close. Can you share a situation or two that capture the human element of apartheid in Israel? And really, I think the phrase we use is that apartheid is in place from the river to the sea. It's not just in the West Bank, it's everywhere, including in Israel proper. But in the course of your writings, can you share a few stories with us that kind of capture the situation? And you'll have to unmute yourself.
Let's, David, speak about the day after tomorrow. What is more simple than this? The day after tomorrow, the only democracy in the Middle East will go for elections. Tuesday, the 23rd. It will be a very free election. People will be able to vote whatever they feel like, secret elections. And then you can travel to the West Bank and see village next to a village. One village will participate in the elections and the village next by will not. And the division line will be ethnic, national, or racist, you can call it. But according to those lines, one village has all the privileges and all the rights, and the other one has none. What is more screaming apartheid than this? And I'm referring obviously to the settlements, to the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, vis-a-vis the Palestinian villages, towns, cities, and refugee camps which surround them. So if someone wants really, if someone has any doubt, and there are many Israelis who have big doubts, and also all kinds of scholars and experts who keep on telling us that we don't know how it was in South Africa, and how dare you to compare, and we have really here world-famous experts to contradict it, like our friend John Dugard and others. But by the end of the day, the best proof is not the legal one. The best proof is to travel and to see it by your own eyes. And it looks like apartheid, and it walks like apartheid, it behaves like apartheid, and it is apartheid. Now you mentioned, and I'll give two more examples as you asked me, David, but you raised a very important question, because for many years, we in Israel, part of us, tried to make the division and say, no, Israel is not an apartheid state, just the regime in the occupied territories is an apartheid system. But this division, this separation is a very artificial one and has no reason and no substance, because by the end of the day, Israel is invested in the occupation, in the settlement project, in the colonialistic project as a state. It's not like it's only about the settlers who went there. It's not only about those companies who built there. It's about the whole system. The whole system is part and parcel of the occupation. The Green Line, as all of you know, was deleted long time ago. It doesn't exist. I can go now from my home to the settlement of Ariel, which is like half an hour drive from here, and I will not feel that I'm crossing any green line. And the local bus here will go there and come back. The only difference will be that I'll be able to do this trip freely without any interference, while my Palestinian friend who lives in a village next to Ariel and was there obviously centuries before the settlers, the Russian settlers who live in Ariel, they cannot join me on my way back to Tel Aviv. Not because of legal questions, only because of the fact that they are Palestinians and I'm Jewish, nothing else by this. So as Zionism is based, I mean, it's really the part of Zionism is based on one principle, And this principle is the Jewish supremacy. And as long as Zionism is the name of the game in Israel, you can't call Israel by any other name but an apartheid state. Now, if you want two more examples from what you see, I invite any of our listeners now and viewers, next time they will be in Palestine, to go to two places. Go to the city of Hebron and go to the Jordan Valley. What you will see in both places is a pure example of apartheid. In the Jordan Valley, you will see villages which have unlimited water, unlimited electricity, unlimited land, which is all stolen land. And next by, there will be a shepherd's community not connected to electricity. We are in 2021, not connected to water, not recognized by the government, living in terrible poverty, and is due to daily attacks by the settlers. When you look at this, when you see all those green orchards and fields of the Jewish settlers, and next by those shepherds who try to resist and try to stick to the land, you can't call it by any other name but apartheid. And then you go southern than them, and you go to the city of Hebron, and you go to the old city of Hebron, maybe the model of apartheid in Israel, because here you see already physical separation. There are streets in the old city of Hebron which are allowed only for Jews. There is a whole commercial center which all its inhabitants were transferred from them and is like a ghost town. You can walk in Hebron and breathe apartheid and smell apartheid. A Jewish child can do there whatever he wants, including throwing garbage and stones at his Palestinian neighbors. A Palestinian will be brought to justice immediately, will be arrested. That's my last remark. There are also two legal systems in Israel. This must be emphasized. Palestinian will go to one court, a Jew will go to another court. What is this if not apartheid?
Thank you, Gideon. Hanan Ashrawi, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you again. Hanan, I've got kind of two closely related questions for you. One is personal and one is political. I'm wondering what it is like to live under apartheid for an individual of your position. You're a political leader, you're an academic, you're a scholar, and you need to travel around and do work. So I'm wondering how this all kind of has an impact on you, but I'm wondering as well what role, this is a larger issue, what role Oslo and the peace process, quote unquote, and the Palestinian Authority played and continue to play, have played in the consolidation of Israel's apartheid regime, in resisting it or in furthering it. So it's kind of personal and political.
Thank you, David. Yes, I would like to have a few hours to respond to your questions, but I will try to be brief because this is really the essence of it. I do not think it is a question of semantics or definitions or identification. Gideon just gave you an active, concrete description of realities on the ground, and both John and Virginia gave you the theory as well as the human rights, legal and international approach to what's happening in Palestine. Many of the South African delegations that came to visit us always told us this is much worse than South Africa. Because when you identify, when you define, you have to identify, and you identify, you have to find means of rectification. Even when you find analogies and parallels, you also have to be able to see distinctiveness and therefore devise the tools in order to rectify such a situation. To me, I live under, regardless of my status or anybody else's status or standing, I live under the most pervasive, intrusive system of injustice and oppression you can imagine in the world, because it permeates every aspect of my life and of all Palestinian people's lives. And if you are more visible, of course, visibility might give you some protection, but that's not enough, because Israel doesn't care about exposure or about censure, since it has always acted with full impunity and without any kind of curbs or intervention. This system, I would like to go back to what my friend Ilan Pape always says, and since I read years ago the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, I believe this is a system, really a displacement replacement paradigm, and it is based on dualities. I believe that there is a mentality that is trying to totally displace, eradicate a nation with our history, our culture, our reality, our territory, even the demography, and replace it with another. They're negating our narrative, our identity, and they're replacing it with another. They're taking over our land and resources and bringing in other people to take over. And the dualities are based on, you have to dehumanize your victim, therefore you have to silence your victim, and you have to render your victim invisible. And so you have a free hand to do whatever you want. But in order to do that, you have to do the other, which is demonize your victim. And therefore show that not only must you not be blamed or held accountable for what you're doing, but you must be praised because you are fighting forces of evil and darkness. This goes within the whole ideological approach, which we can talk about later, and that your victim deserves what happens. And therefore the Palestinians not only deserve what is happening to them, but the Israelis have to be praised for fighting terrorism, for fighting forces of evil and so on, and for upholding a biblical narrative and so on. And therefore they continue with this. You dehumanize, you demonize, you render your victim more vulnerable, and therefore you create another duality, which is that the Palestinians are totally vulnerable without any kind of protection, and the Israeli occupation and the whole Israeli system, Israel as a state, can act with full impunity and therefore has layers and layers of superiority, of immunity to act with full impunity for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about later. And this explains this displacement replacement, because when we talk about Israel as a colonial reality in the region, a settler colonial system, it's not enough either, because settler colonials wanted to rule and wanted to govern, wanted to steal resources and so on. But here you have a settler colonial system that was an occupation, but also gained permanence. It's not a temporary occupation. It's not just for gain. It is a whole ideological system. And as a complete system, those of you who haven't read Nathan Thrall's article, I don't know if you've seen it.
We have.
And a day in the life of, anyway, I wrote it down because I read it.
Hanan, what role has
Salama.
I'm sorry, what role?
I think you should do that, but that explains it very well, yes. So let me say that when you are in that system, you cannot fragment it. You cannot look at little bits of it. You have to look at the totality of it and at the context. So we are here in a situation that tells you you have no rights, you have no humanity, you are blamed for what happens to you, you are living in a fragmentation and siege with total control and with no rights.
And
I can give you
perversely, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian polity has been drawn into this as a participant. Can you?
Yes, I will go to The flaw, the fatal flaw, I think, is in the Oslo agreements, what is called the Oslo agreements, or the Declaration of Principles and the subsequent agreements. Because not only did they incorporate the power equilibrium, this equilibrium and asymmetry, they also enabled Israel to continue, definitely supported by the US, supported by the West, supported by a whole system of Western entitlement, in the sense that looks at Israel as an extension of a Western colonial system, an outpost, a colonial outpost, and therefore gives it privilege. So the agreements in themselves separated the people from the land, adopted the functional approach rather than the territorial approach, dealt with peripheral side issues, technical issues, rather than with the core issues of, if you want to talk about two states, of the land, of the borders, and the illegality of settlements and so on, and managed really to enter a whole tunnel of an interim phase that became endless, that became permanent, and allowed Israel to exploit its power and its total control over the Palestinians. And in a sense, it created a situation where the victim was supposed to be held responsible for the safety of the occupier. We are at the mercy of another duality: the soldiers, the Israeli occupation army, and the settlers, who act outside the law and again with full impunity. And I'm sure Gideon has written a lot about this. This is a reign of terror every day. And that, because the agreement postponed all these issues and postponed what is called the permanent status issues without assurances, without intervention, Israel gave itself a free hand to use its power in order to manipulate the situation, to buy more time, to create more facts, to expand, and to continue this pervasive system of oppression. So I think that the agreements have played into the hands of Israel, have maintained, not only maintained a system of apartheid, but I think have created a permanent occupation on the verge of completing the displacement replacement paradigm.
Hanan Ashrawi, I'd like to pivot to our second theme about impunity. Hanan, you've spoken over the years with countless politicians, leaders, foreign ministers from Europe, from Canada and the United States, internationally. Are they blind to the fact that Israel practices apartheid? What do they say when you talk to them about Israeli apartheid?
Actually, international politics is an extremely cynical state of affairs, and extremely manipulative and self-serving. There is no such thing as a moral dimension. I've talked to many people. I've talked to leaders, from presidents and kings and prime ministers, and it's not the issue of talking to educate people. In many cases, they do know, but it is their self-interest. It is the way they view Israel, with its sense of entitlement and exceptionalism, with a variety of things. The other day we had a webinar on the EU, and I said the EU in many ways will not challenge Israel for a variety of reasons. And one is the fact that it is a colonial outpost, an extension of white European colonial policy in the region. Two, the guilt over the Holocaust and the fact that it will not be in any way party to anything that criticizes Israel or sanctions it, because of their history of Holocaust, of discrimination and the horror of the Holocaust. And three, because they have benefits. Because Israel, in a way, is a good partner in research and intelligence and military supplies and military maneuvers and so on. So they do, and they tell me openly, they do have benefits. And of course, then there is the European-American, the transatlantic alliance, which is beneficial to both. So when the US takes a clear stand against the Palestinians, and of course, Canada, particularly under Stephen Harper, then the Europeans don't want to work at cross purposes with the Americans. And they divided their roles. The Americans have the political domain, and the Europeans have the economic, institution or nation building domain. And they will not interfere, they will not confront each other. And even when you challenge them, even when their own parliaments, look, in the UK, even in Germany, in France, everywhere, the parliaments have openly asked for a recognition of Palestine, for example, have openly expressed support for Palestinian freedom, self-determination, and rights. And yet the governments proceed, when it comes to Palestine, to do exactly the opposite and to maintain their alliance. You mentioned the picture you saw of me with Chrystia Freeland, right? Listen, it was such a relief to see the Stephen Harper regime, fundamentalist regime, end. And when I had that meeting, it was the first time she came after that, because we had no contacts with the Harper regime, including with the representative office in Ramallah. And when she came, we decided that as women and blah, 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 that we are going to start a new era, a new phase, and that this blind support for Israel will not continue, that we will have a new dialogue between Canada and Palestine. And I felt encouraged, and I said, yes, this is what needs to be done. It turns out, again, when Canada wanted to enter the Security Council as a non-permanent member, what did they do? We want to go to the Security Council to be what, a defender of Israel or whatever, an asset to serve Israeli interests. We couldn't believe this. They seem to think there is this conception that to get anywhere, whether in peacemaking, whether in recognition or legitimacy, then you have to praise Israel, you mustn't, you have to serve Israel, actually. And so it was, I mean, unconscionable that one country wants to enter the Security Council to serve another country. The way John Baird, remember, when he gave the speech at the Security Council on behalf of Israel, that Israel didn't even give. He went beyond Israel. So in a sense, you have people who volunteer, even when you talk to them, even when you know, for a variety of reasons. Some of them, like John Baird and Stephen Harper, have ideological reasons. They are, after all, evangelicals, weren't they? Then there are others who have self-interest, others who have white supremacist identification, which is ironic because, like in the Trump administration, most of the white supremacists are anti-Semitic. And yet they believe that anti-Semitism can be forgiven if they show blind support to Israel. Like the evangelicals who believe that if you blindly support Israel, then you will have, you know, Armageddon, then you will have the second coming and so on. So, and then the anti-Semitism is okay. So this is a very intricate and complex set. Israel is a Western creation, and it is a creation on Palestinian land. And to be able to challenge the international community means that they have to unlearn, and they have to enter into a whole new, essentially different set of values and systems to humanize the Palestinians and stop the demonization, and to understand the reality and their culpability in the whole history of the creation of the State of Israel and the negation of Palestinian rights.
Thank you so much, Hanan. John Dugard, what are the prospects for the system of impunity to be broken at the level of the international legal institutions, the International Criminal Court, or CERD, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or the International Court of Justice? Where do you see accountability finally happening within those institutions?
Well, I think it's essential that Israeli politicians and military leaders should be held accountable for their crimes. And it is quite clear that states are not going to hold them accountable. Hanan has given reasons for the failure of leaders to react to Israel's crimes. I would simply add that I think that the whole notion of anti-Semitism is being exploited by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which is simply designed to suppress criticism of Israeli apartheid. So in the absence of action on the part of governments, it remains to be seen whether international tribunals can achieve some measure of accountability. And I think the International Criminal Court is the most important institution in this respect, because the International Criminal Court has now found, or a pre-trial chamber of the court has found, that the court does have jurisdiction to examine crimes committed on the territory of Palestine, that is the occupied Palestinian territory. And now it has opened an investigation into crimes committed by Israel. And there are allegations of crimes committed both by Israel and by Hamas. But I think it's very important that the prosecutor has indicated that she is pursuing the whole question of the crime of settlements, the transfer of Israeli civilians into the occupied territory. And this is really, really important, because Israel's legitimacy is now questioned. In the first place, the moral fiber of the Israeli Defense Forces is being questioned. You will recall that countless Israeli politicians and military leaders have said that Israel has the most moral army in the world. And now we're seeing that its leaders are being accused of having committed war crimes. So the legitimacy of the Israeli Defense Forces is questioned. And now, in addition, the leaders responsible for the construction of the settlement empire are being questioned and being accused of criminal conduct. And I think this is very important to remove the legitimacy of the whole enterprise of Israel via the Palestinians. And this was really what ultimately led to the downfall, I believe, of apartheid, that the international community, and indeed many members of the white community in South Africa, ultimately accepted that apartheid was morally wrong and was illegitimate. And I think that this is a slow process, but I think that the fact that the International Criminal Court has now opened an investigation into Israelis' criminal conduct will raise questions about the morality and legitimacy of Israel's conduct. And I think this is an important development to secure accountability.
I want to. We're a little bit behind schedule, as inevitably. So I want to quickly jump to the third theme, which is, and give each of you a chance to talk about this. Like, where do we go from here? What's the solution to all this? If one can imagine such a thing as a solution. Virginia, Tilley, how best to achieve equality and justice in Palestine, Israel? Is it through redoubled negotiations towards two states? And here I'm being provocative, of course, because I know your answer. Or is it a return to the ideas that were formulated, in 1936 and 1937, like in the late Mandate years, revolving around a single state? What's the approach, Virginia?
Well, yeah, I guess I've kind of, made my name as kind of the one state woman out here in some ways. But I think the evidence backs me up. And I do have to say, I'm really thrilled to be with this group of people in this forum. But, one reason I'm thrilled about it is because I think it is time for us to stop talking about the two-state solution. It is just a fraud. There's all kinds of research on how it's a fraud. There's live library. I'm sitting around piles of books piled around me of evidence that it's a fraud. The Israelis know it's a fraud. This confinement of the whole problem to the West Bank and Gaza Strip is, I think, a very big mistake. It's accepting a Bantustan strategy that Israel has been working on for decades. it is, there's only one reason for these lines around these territories that are increasingly fictional, especially in the case of the West Bank. They don't exist anymore, as has already been pointed out. There's only one reason for those borders, and that's racism. Okay, to keep Israel a Jewish state, you must keep non-Jews from intermixing with Jewish people and getting the vote and changing laws, just like in South Africa. They had to keep white and black people strictly segregated in order to maintain the state in white nationalist hands. This is, in South Africa, there's a whole story about how whiteness became kind of conflated in the government with Afrikaner nationalism, which is a kind of a separate animal. It's the Dutch settlers came up with their own ideology of settler colonial rights and infused with ideas about God and the covenant and how they were expressing the will of God and all this kind of thing. I mean, it's really something that people who study Palestine should look at. And John Dugard knows more about this than you know, practically any living human being, you know, and for that reason, you know, I've always kind of brewing this idea of challenging you, John, in the way that one challenges a man of your gigantic stature who, you know, in my view, walks on water. I mean, I do want to challenge you about your unwillingness to apply apartheid inside Israel, to understand this regime as replicating in many ways the geographic and conceptual divisions that South Africa put forward. It's all designed to protect Jewish statehood. Jewish statehood is a racist by definition. That is no way to diminish the terrible suffering of the Jewish people in the 20th century and in many centuries before that. It's in no way meant to imply any risk to Jewish lives or safety or well-being, but to attach the rights of a people to a state in the way that Israel has done is understood everywhere to be illegitimate. Every place it's legitimate. There's no way in the world talk of a demographic threat could be deployed even in the United States with all of our racism. You can't say something like that. And this, the division of the territories, the idea of a Palestinian state, you know, some kind of vestigial Palestinian state in the West Bank is absolutely Botswana. There's not really any significant difference at all there. I think Israel learned a lot from South African Bantustans. I think they picked up the Bantustan constitutions and they plugged them right into the Oslo Accords. I actually did a paper on this very briefly, comparing the constitutions of the Bantustans with the Oslo Accords and the provisions for the PA and the Black self-government authorities, Palestinian self-government authority. The parallels are just overwhelming. And you have to go to the regime on that. You have to say that the state of Israel has to be one thing. Bande Palestine was supposed to be one country. It was established in 1922 by the League of Nations to be one democratic state for everybody who lived there. And that is what went wrong with, you know, what it should, that is the model. It's not just 1936 and 37, as you mentioned, David, it's 1922. We're coming up on the centennial next year. And I think it's time to take that centennial moment and go back to 1922 and affirm Mandate Palestine as one state for everybody who lives there. I also think that if that's done, the Palestinians will instantly inherit a tremendous body of international human rights law, all the great conventions against racial discrimination and colonialism will come into play, which is a far more powerful argument for the Palestinians to make than the claim to self-determination. I sometimes have this little anecdote that if the
I'm going to jump in here, Virginia. My apologies, because we're kind of time is
Sure.
going by. Hanan Ashrawi, can you comment?
David, could I just respond briefly?
Sure, yes, John, please.
She has misunderstood my position completely. I accept completely that there is apartheid in Israel proper. The question is, where is the crime of apartheid committed, and where will a court have jurisdiction over that crime? And the answer is that Palestine is a member of the International Criminal Court as a state, and this entitles the International Criminal Court to examine crimes committed in that territory. And that's the importance of looking at the crime of apartheid in the context of a Palestinian state. And I think Virginia must understand that what I'm saying is that apartheid is applied in the state of Israel itself, but it's the crime of apartheid that is committed in the occupied territory over which the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. And it has no jurisdiction over apartheid committed in Israel itself.
And the International Court of Justice, John, where does where might the ICJ fit into?
That's not a criminal court, so it would have no criminal jurisdiction over crimes committed in Israel or the occupied territory.
I have a question for you, John, though, if I may. This is an informational question. Couldn't the ICJ, an advisory opinion by the ICJ that this regime equates with the practice of apartheid, be significant on the international stage?
The General Assembly would have to ask the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the question of apartheid. And of course, that could be done. But the General Assembly would have to pose that question. The only case before the ICJ present involving Israel is the relocation of the United States Embassy to Jerusalem.
Hanan Ashrawi, what are your thoughts on this? Like what, two states versus one state? I mean, the question,
I don't believe,
what's the solution? What's the solution?
Is two state or one state, frankly speaking. I think neither one is available now. Israel is busy destroying the two-state solution and is busy taking over all of Palestine. And in its ideological system, it is a cohesive totality where to be able to remove parts of it means that you negate the validity of your whole argument, since you entered the ideological dimension, where this is all Eretz Israel, this is all biblical land, this is all our rights. I actually had an Israeli woman tell me, you don't understand, we are the chosen people, that's it. And you have no chance of getting anywhere. This is our land, God gave it to us. And there are many people who believe that. So in a sense, the thinking that there is ways in which you can begin to dismantle or deconstruct the system means that you are deconstructing the whole ideological foundation of the state of Israel. It didn't start out that way. And if you read the historical evolution of this ideology, it became really a political blueprint and a justification, to the point where one politician, I forgot who, said, we don't need to show anything, laws and whatever. All we need to do is take the Bible anywhere we go and say, this is our land deed, this is our constitution, this is the basis of our rights. So in a sense, to me, it becomes really not very relevant to talk about one state or two states. It becomes relevant to see not whether we can go back to the past, Virginia, because there are many resolutions. There are many, even past 1922 when Palestine, and 1923, the Newcomb Commission and the borders of Palestine that Israel says belong to it and so on. So the question is now, how do we curb Israeli violations? How do we create a system of accountability for Israel and a system of protection for Palestine? One. Two, I don't believe the Palestinians alone have the solution. The two-state solution was not the ideal solution for the Palestinians at all. I remember years in which the UN and everybody was telling us, you have to accept partition. This is the will of the international community. Once you accept partition, miraculously, everything will be resolved and, God's in his heaven as well with the world. And of course, when the Palestinians accepted partition, they said, no, you have to accept not 181, but 242 and 338, 67. When we said, no, the refugee issue, and the whole issue did not start in 47, 48, in 67, it started in 47, 48, they said, no, this is the will of the international community and there are resolutions and so on. And then when we entered negotiations on the basis of partition, we were told that Israel cannot be held to account and you have to extricate yourself out of the this occupation by yourselves. And then we ended up with these secret negotiations and a deeply flawed and lethal agreement. So the question is first of all, of agency. The Palestinians, in many ways, do not have objective power. We have moral power, we have human power, we have resilience, we have people who are staying on the land, but they are being bashed. And there is a political will and an international will to try to force them into submission. And to try, as Jared Kushner and others and Israelis are saying, you have to accept the mentality of defeat. And it drives them nuts that the Palestinians are not defeated and will not accept the mentality of defeat and will not surrender. But the question is, if you don't surrender, what is the, not light at the end of the tunnel, but what is the light in general? Where do people go? If you tell them the two-state solution, they're seeing it disappear before their very eyes, it's gone. If you say one-state solution, you're seeing also the perpetuation of an occupation. And you see, Virginia said that we will have at our disposal all the body of laws and so on. But when we were recognized as a state by the General Assembly, albeit non-member state, we were able to join the ICC, to accede to the Rome Statute and join. Before we weren't. We were turned down repeatedly. So in some ways, and that's why I'm saying in some ways, having a status would help you make use of available statutes and available organizations and institutions to hold Israel to account. And it will define all the violations that Israel is doing, whether in terms of it's the attacks also on Gaza, remember, 2014. It's not just the settler enterprise that is a war crime. It's also the killing, the willful killing of civilians and whole families. And the bombing and shelling of civilians. And so in some ways, you can avail yourself of what is there, but at the same time, all the tools and instruments of international law and the judicial system do not protect the Palestinians sufficiently and do not induce political will on the part of the politicians and the governments in the world. So if we talk about let's work on a historical Palestine. This was something we proposed in 1968, 69. Those of you who are my age might remember that we said one democratic, non-sectarian, inclusive state for everybody. And it didn't work because it's not enough what the victim says. You have to have allies, you have to have takers, you have to have also the context. In the post-colonial world, there was a context, there were allies. Right now, the allies are with Israel. The Palestinian allies are people of conscience, are institutions and organizations. There's a whole network of people, solidarity with Palestine. And until there is an evolution of this context into a system that would hold Israel and curb its violence, would hold it accountable, because if Israel there's nothing to be paid, it will continue. Israel does not pay a price for whatever it does. And its impunity is actually rewarded. So we have to reverse this. I don't know who said this. We have to reverse this situation where Israel understands that it is accountable, that there is a price to be paid, and that it will not always be given this preferential treatment and exclusivity of rights. So I'm saying, I'm sorry that there is no two-state, there is no one state. There is a state of flux, and there is a state in which Palestinian victimization is ongoing and Israeli impunity is ongoing. Whether we can reverse this situation and we can evolve different systems along with like-minded people to have a real impact on global organizations and on international governments, then Israel will just persist.
Thank you, Hanan. I think this is what Noam Chomsky referred to as the no-state solution. The no-state solution. It's like the status quo indefinitely into the future.
Not a solution at all. Yeah. No, it's not. The status quo is extremely painful and destructive. You have to stop the status quo, and you have to intervene decisively.
Gideon Levy, what are your thoughts on all this? I want to move to throwing out a few questions that have come before us from something approaching 400 people watching at the moment, and who knows how many on Facebook. But Gideon, what are your thoughts on solutions or
I
avenues?
totally understand Hanan's sentiment, and in a way also sense of despair. And the situation is very of a lot of despair. I think the Palestinians right now are in their worst position ever since 48. I will not get into details, but the world lost interest. The Arab world never had interest. Israel is stronger than ever. The Palestinians are weaker than ever, divided, lacking leadership, lacking sense of struggle. You can draw a whole list, and by the end of the day, you will lose any kind of hope for anything. Add to this the fact that those of us who think that the Israelis will wake up one shining morning and say, oh, the occupation is not so nice, let's put an end to it. Or apartheid is not our system, let's do something about it. It didn't happen for 53 years or for 100 years, and it will never happen. It will not come from within Israel. Don't expect it to happen. Israelis have no reason to change the system because their life is very good and they pay no price and they are totally not punished for anything. So in this context, you really lose any kind of hope. Obviously, the two-state solution, not only is dead, I think it was never born, and here I totally agree with Virginia, it is a fraud. There was never an Israeli statesman, a prime minister, who seriously meant a two-state solution. What they suggested were Bantustans in order to gain more time, to strengthen the settlements, to silence the world. Now, the two-state solution is a wonderful solution for everybody because it gives you the feeling that there is a solution. It is on the shelf, and whenever there will be good conditions, we'll just take it down and use it. That's a lie, because it was never on the shelf. It was never a real solution. Israel never meant it, never, no one meant it seriously. And this leads me to another conclusion that we have to put in our mind very, very strongly, and this is the illusion that the occupation is a temporary phenomenon. That just we will find either the partner or the peace process or the American president or the Palestinian Nelson Mandela, and here we go, there is an end to the occupation. No, the occupation was never meant to be temporary, and it's not temporary after so many years, when right now we are far from a solution than 50 years ago. And I don't see it happening at all as long as one thing happens, and this is the wake-up call from the international community, which also I don't see right now. But all this leaves us only with despair, and this is not an option. I think, unlikely Hanan, I think we need a vision. I think we need an end game. We need a goal. Because otherwise, all our struggle, and all of us here are struggling, we need something which will motivate our struggle. Despair is a very bad fuel for a struggle. And therefore, I think that we should start at least a new discourse, a discourse of equality and only equality. Stop fighting over the settlements because this war was won already by the settlers. Stop talk about boundaries and borders because right now it's totally irrelevant. Not about peace process, not about peace even. Let's start to talk about equality, about one person, one voice, about equality between the river and the sea. Right now, it seems unthinkable that this will become a solution. But what are the alternatives? The two-state solution is not on the table. And really agree more with Virginia. Anyone who speaks now about the two-state solution does it only to gain more time for documentation. I don't know anyone who genuinely believes in the two-state solution and knows reality. The Europeans, for them, it's wonderful to speak about the two-state solution. The Americans the same, the PA the same. It's convenient for everybody, but it is maybe the biggest lie in the recent decades. If we'll start to speak about equality, if we'll start to speak about equal rights, it's a long journey to go, but it's a beginning, and you see some kind of vision by the end of the day or by the end of the century.
May I say something here, Gideon?
Sure.
Look, I don't have despair at all. I just understand the reality for what it is. And I know where Israel is heading. And I see every day how many Palestinians are killed, how many homes are being demolished, how much land we are losing every day. So the question is not to succumb to this, but to maintain Palestinians' ability to resist, to persist, and to withstand this onslaught. This, to me, is our primary issue. We talked about equality for years. We talked about human rights for decades. We talked about the rule of law, global rule of law for also decades. It's not enough. It's not enough to talk about rights and equality and the right to live in dignity. Yes, we can talk about all these values and principles, but unless they are translated into a plan of action, unless we do have a vision, but the vision right now is being totally battered and bashed and destroyed. What we need to do is find ways and handles and mechanisms and provide the Palestinians with the agency to be able to stay on the land, because there are really efforts at work to try to carry out this transfer, as you know, to carry out the expulsion of Palestinians, as well as the grouping them into their isolated Bantustans and so on. There are forces at work that we have to counter, instead of just saying we want to be equal and free and to live in dignity and so on. It's not enough. How do you translate that into a political program, into a plan of action? How do you get allies? The anti-colonial and the post-colonial movements all had allies.
Can I jump in here? Can I jump in here?
Yes, Virginia, please, I'd like to hear.
Well,
Yes.
I so agree with you, Hanan, on this, and I think Gideon just wrapped it up by talking about the importance of a vision. I think there's consensus across this group that there needs to be a direction. There's consensus that the battles. I came in the mid-'80s. Okay, I came into this issue in the mid-'80s. And there was heroic work going on at that time about the land and the settlements and the prisoners and the children and the administrative detention and the tortures and no. It's all worse now. Okay, it's all worse now. There does need to be a vision. There does need to be a direction. I so agree with Gideon on that. I'm glad you chimed in on that. But I think it has to center, there are no rights unless there are governments to effect them. You can't get around the question of one state, two states. Some people are tired of the debate. They want to push it to one side and just focus on human rights. Human rights are implemented by governments. We have to know what kind of state is being sought here. And here's an idea I'd like to throw out.
And if you could do it quickly, Virginia.
Yeah, I will. The struggles you talked about in the 60s and 70s, that was before apartheid gripped the global imagination. That was before the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa redefined the nature of race and governance in that location and created a convention on apartheid. That was before the fall of apartheid in 1990-ish, 1994. There's a lot of track record here. There's a lot of global consciousness that has come about over the recent decades. And I think that we know they're not going to withdraw from the West Bank. We know that, accept that, give that up. They're not going to withdraw from the West Bank. If they're not going to withdraw from the West Bank, you're automatically back to mandate Palestine. You're automatically back to that geography. There's only one state running the sting now. And I think the tremendous resources that were created for the Palestinians by the struggle in South Africa are just lying there waiting to be picked up. And I don't agree that the Palestinians don't have power in this situation. I think, as Olmert said, that if the Palestinians turn this campaign into an anti-apartheid struggle, Israel is finished as a Jewish state. I think that's where the power lies, is to change the nature of the discourse, and it's just lying there. And I've got my eye on you, Hanan, because I've admired you for decades, and as one of the really shining lights in this movement. And I don't think that pertains across the gamut of the PA, the people in charge now. I think I'm looking at you on my screen.
Well, I'm going to jump in at this point, Virginia, and ask. I mean, there's so many questions we've gotten, and some of them are very lengthy. But I'll ask one question that is incredibly concrete. Hanan Ashrawi, are you running in the upcoming Palestinian elections?
No, David. I practice what I preach. I work with young people, men and women, and I'm trying to support people who are running. But at the same time, there are 94%. This is just goes to tell you the dilemma and the complexity of the situation. 94% of the people of Palestine registered to vote, which tells you how hungry they are to have a sense of agency, to be able to have control over their own lives. And this, to me, is very important, given the fact that they're running for a legislative council under occupation and under the control of Israel. Is this reinforcing the Bantustan, or is this empowering the Palestinians in order to resist the Israeli apartheid system? This is it. No, I'm not running because I believe it's time for the young to take over and for the women, more women to take over. And I said I will sponsor. I have many people whom I'm supporting, and I will campaign for them. And I think we should have real elections. And I don't believe in having a national list of Hamas and Fatah running together with the other little factions, because Palestinian people need the right to choose their own leadership, to hold their leadership accountable, and to make room for the younger generations.
John Dugard, final thought. Would you like to share a final thought or two with us? Take about a minute. You're going to have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, John. Unmute, no, unmute yourself.
I think one should perhaps see the state of Palestine as a Trojan horse. It's a way of undermining the state of Israel, because the fact that there is a state does allow the Palestinian people to resort to international measures to support them. And as Hanan has rightly pointed out, the Palestinian legislature would give the Palestinian people an opportunity to express their resistance more powerfully. So I don't think one should dismiss the state of Palestine, albeit only as a strategy to empower the Palestinian people.
And international law, John, I mean, you must despair of international law sometimes. It is obviously completely aspirational. Like here in Canada, Trudeau and Freeland and company, they're always going on about how Canada is a rule of law nation, upholding the international rule of law. It's nonsense. Do you despair?
Yeah, obviously, I despair of international law, but I think one must take the decision of the International Criminal Court to exercise jurisdiction and to start an investigation into crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory as a serious development in order to secure accountability and justice in the for the Palestinian people as a whole.
Yeah, may I say that's the one thing that the Americans and the Israelis insisted that the Palestinians must never do, is go to the ICC. They saw this as what they said was the nuclear weapon of the Palestinians, that they could go to the ICC. And now
which
Israel
is a very good reason to do it, which is a very good reason to do it, Hanan.
And we're going to the ICC because we know this is one way. If we weren't a state, we wouldn't be able to go. We were turned back, as you know, earlier. And now the people who are attacking our approach are saying Palestine is not a state. We don't recognize Palestine as a state, so it should not have access to the Rome Statute or the ICC. But we are persistent, we will go. And this is the first time in the history of Israel that there is real accountability, that there is a global mechanism at work here, not just to curb Israeli violations, but to hold them accountable. And they know they committed war crimes and apartheid as a crime against humanity. But knowing that, now they're busy trying to prepare to attack the court, to intimidate the judges, to intimidate Fatou Bensouda and her successor now. The thing is, they are willing to twist the global legal system and the judicial system in order to subject it to this traditional, habitual, preconceived notion that Israel is above the law and above accountability and can do whatever it wants. And this thing, to me, is very important. That's why they're waxing hysterical all over the place, because now people can be held to account. And that probably is the beginning of the shift, Virginia, maybe. That
Well,
I know.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Hanan. And I'm sorry, David. I just want
No, please.
I am not confident. I'm loving the ICC process, right? And I'm rooting for it because I think it's high time Israel's held accountable. On the other hand, I don't see anything significant coming out for the Palestinians from an ICC finding that Israel committed war crimes at some point in one of the many attacks it's made on the Palestinian people. If that's all that comes out of that ICC judgment, Israel will do what it always does. Anti-Semitism and a general global, conspiracy against the Jewish state, and everything will roll on. I don't know.
But individuals can be held accountable. That's what they're saying.
That's
they have
fine,
a
but
whole
then that will roll on for years and come some kind of tangle. I don't see the settlements not being built. I don't see the farms not being confiscated. I don't see the houses in East Jerusalem not being bulldozed in all of that time. I don't see serious good things for the practical people on the ground coming out of the ICC report, even if it's pretty favorable. The only way it would matter is if they actually say this is an apartheid state. That would really rock the world. But that is optional in this situation. I've asked about that, and it's not clear that they're going to look at that. Technically they could, but there's no mention of it. And I'm concerned that people are piling so much hope into this thing, and there's not going to be much gotten out of it without what Gideon said and what you said, frankly, which is this idea about what is the goal here? What is the enemy? What is the real enemy? It's not a few war crimes of disgusting behavior by Israel toward an innocent civilian population. The real crime is Israel's creating a situation of racial discrimination on the ground to control an entire population of people. And that doctrine itself is driving all of these human rights
So maybe the only way out is to de-Zionize Israel, the way Avram Burg and
Yes.
even Peter Beinart said, that
Yes.
the only way to tackle the core of the issue is to tackle Zionism itself.
May
I
I
think
ask?
so.
May I ask Gideon? Gideon, can you weigh in quickly on the role of, I think, global civil society? I myself think it's going to be global civil society working in cooperation, partnership with the Palestinian people, and maybe the media fits in here somewhere. Tell me where you think global civil society and the media, mass media, fit in, Gideon Levy.
But let me just answer Hanan, because my idea was by all means not a spiritual, holistic new game of talking about equality and shaking hands and hugging each other. No, by all means not. The idea about speaking about equality means putting an end to the idea of a Jewish state, putting an end to Zionism, and that's the only way to approach it. It's a very long run, but I didn't mean something which only talks about values. It has very, very concrete political consequences and very revolutionary ones. And the only ones that I believe can bring something which does not contradict what you suggested, because it can go hand to hand. On one hand, continue to struggle. On the other hand, to have a vision. It doesn't contradict. But when the vision is false, like the two-state solution, when the vision is a fraud, as Virginia called it, then the whole structure has no basis, neither ideological nor practical, because you fight for Bantustan, you fight for a train that left the station, if it was there at all. Anyhow, to your question, David, the only hope is the international community. There is no other hope. It must come from there. It must start there. And when I say international community, it's mainly civil societies, because governments will not do it. As Hanan said, and as I experienced it throughout the years, many politicians think like us and understand the problem, but they will never do anything, because all the reasons that were mentioned here, anti-Semitism, or using anti-Semitism, Holocaust, interests, and so forth. The only hope is really the civil societies. You see some shifts in the United States, in the campuses, in Europe, but we don't have to have too many illusions, because at the same time, I see also a sense of fatigue and losing interest. Let's be honest. The world has less and less interest. There are new issues coming up, and I'm not sure that the interest that we were witnessing 10 and 20 years ago is as intensive today. But you know it more, you who live overseas know about it more, but it's no doubt that the legal struggle and the popular struggle depends in both cases on civil societies, on the international community, and only from there it will start. And then I hope we will recruit enough forces, both in the Palestinian society and maybe one day also in the Israeli society, even though it doesn't seem so like now, right now, and then something will move. My last sentence will be that in John Dugard's country, in South Africa, former country, many things were unthinkable, and they happened. And they happened because of the international struggle and the local struggle, and it went together. What is lacking right now and very painful for me is that, unlikely South Africa, where white people, and including many of the Jewish community, struggled together with the Black community, went to jail, fought, got injured and got killed. We don't see this in Israeli society. I don't see the same solidarity almost from no one. I hope this will change one day.
John, do you want to comment on that?
No,
My friend John Dugard?
No, I think Gideon has summed it up very accurately. Civil society is the key.
But may I offer?
Hold on. Let John finish.
I'm sorry, John.
No, I just say I agree entirely with Gideon that civil society provides the answer to the future. States and governments will not do anything.
That's a very sad conclusion, although I agree with you.
Well, the trouble with it, I agree with it in principle. The problem is that I went on 2 speaking tours in Europe over the last few years, and when I got the impression civil society is asking the people I'm looking at on the screen for a direction. I got asked this all the time. What are we struggling for? If there's no 2-state solution, what are we struggling for? What is the framework for this? How do we understand Palestinian right to self-determination? How do we understand Palestinian rights at all? We're confused. We've asked the BDS, people for direction. We're not getting it from them. I got this question all over Europe and Canada with David, by the way, in a wonderful conference that he put together a few years ago. There's a great confusion right now about what's going on. Ian Lustick just put a book out called Paradigm Lost. I think we are in a paradigm shift. I think it's a confusing time. And I do think that a lot of ideological work needs to happen in order to make sense of what's going on, just as colonialism of a special type in South Africa. That's what they called it, colonialism of a special type, settler colonialism. How do you have self-determination with millions of settler colonists in the same country? How do you make ideological sense of that? I think that's the project for the Palestinian leadership. And that's what I meant when I said, I'm looking at you, Hanan.
Hanan?
Because, this needs inspired principled leadership to help conduct the internal discussion within Palestinian nationalism to make sense of this. And then that will feed out to civil society. And I think you will find a lot of people piling in on civil society on this question when it's reframed that way.
I want to jump in. Hanan Ashrawi, can you talk about this? And I'm wondering, where do young people in Palestine fit in? What role are young Palestinians playing, and will they play?
Well, most young Palestinians see the death of the two-state solution, not because they abandoned it. Many Palestinians still want to live in their own state, still want to have their own sense of sovereignty and borders and so on. And they become quite resentful when people tell them, let's abandon the idea of the nation state. And they say, why is it that when it comes to Palestine, we'll abandon it, but when it comes to other people, you won't? But on the whole, people are really moving beyond the two-state solution because they see its demise before their very eyes. But they also do not see that just, as Gideon said, talking about rights and so on is enough. That, as Virginia said, we need to have a plan of action. What do we do now? We need concrete steps. Now, there are many theoreticians, many people who write, many academics, many intellectuals who write the same way as Virginia and John and others are writing, and they talk about the one state or the need for a vision. But at the same time, without this interaction, without a healthy conversation, not dialogue, a real inclusive conversation in which to discuss the components and the directions of this new vision, you cannot just keep talking about how the Palestinians have to have a new vision, because they are compelled in many ways to ensure the resilience and steadfastness of the people on the ground. And at the same time, they see their land and resources being stolen. At the same time, they are subject to this unconscionable cruelty by the settlers and the army. And they don't have the luxury to say, we're going to talk and we're going to think and we're going to take our time, because every day a lot of damage is done. Now, the Palestinians of 48 owned over 93% of their land. What do they have now? Less than 3% of their land. Because this is how Israel manages to encroach and to take more land and so on. Where would the Palestinians exist? The Palestine of 1922 that you talked about has been eaten up by Israel, by the settlements, by the expansionism. And so can you undo that? You can't. Would it be automatically unraveled? Should the Palestinians say we want one state? I think that if theoretically, intellectually, ideologically, maybe we should tackle the issue from the beginning as an issue of a destructive ideology, an exclusivist, exclusionary ideology based on superiority of rights, which is Zionism. So perhaps this should be, as I said, Avram Burg, Peter Beinart, among others. I think Gideon was among the first to discuss this. Let's lay this bare. Let's discuss this exclusivist superior ideology that is used to cover all sorts of things. And let's see how maybe sane and rational-minded Jews and the Arabs and Christians and Muslims and non-believers and atheists and whatever can come together and say that what we need is not an ideology, but a human vision.
Hanan Ashrawi, I salute you from Winnipeg. I want to thank Hanan Ashrawi and John Dugard and Gideon Levy and Virginia Tilley. I can't wrap my head around these four names. It's been wonderful, a delight. And this is all being videoed. And I think I'm going to pass the ball over back to Bianca, who will kind of close the show for all of us. And what can I say? Thank you all very, very much. It's been a privilege.
Thank you, David. Thank you to everyone at home for joining. Thank you to our panelists for a lively, totally riveting discussion. Thank you, Hanan, Gideon, Virginia, John, and thank you, David, for your moderation. Nous sommes désolés du délai avec la traduction. J'espère que tout le monde pourra y accéder. It's been quite an extraordinary event. I think I speak for everyone in saying that, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your insights, your time, your frustrations, and your vision. A powerful discussion and an educational one. I know I learned a lot. So audience, let's heed these words about the importance of pressure from the international community, from civil society, and take up the challenge of meaningfully supporting Palestinian rights and self-determination. I also want to thank the translators, a very difficult job to translate such complex and poignant points of view. Thank you so much. Thank you to the interpreters, Antonio and Ared. Before we go, I just have a few announcements. Again, as you all know, this work is not possible without donations, so please consider making a contribution to the work of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute at foreignpolicy.ca/donations, or become a monthly sustainer. You can do the same at ijvcanada.org/donations. Please sign up for our newsletters. The links are in the chat. We also have an upcoming event on April 5th at 7 p.m. featuring former MPs Libby Davies, Sven Robinson, as well as Zaya El Masri and Rabbi David Mivaser on Palestine solidarity and the importance of the upcoming NDP convention. So you can register for that. The links in the chat. You can also find out more at foreignpolicy.ca. It's an important moment for Palestine solidarity in Canada. So thanks again to our incredible panelists. Thank you, David, for moderating, IJV. Thank you, Aaron Lakoff, David Heap, and other folks working behind the scenes to bring this event to all of you. Wishing you a good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. That's it for our program today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.